that the sign for us to start?
I think we're up.
Really? That was
yeah, after the gong.
The bell tolls for us then. Thank you very much for joining us. Just a few stragglers coming in this truly magnificent hall. The title of our panel is Democracy in Times of Zuckerberg and Qiang. My name is Pomerantsev. I run a little think tank at the London School of Economics that looks at all things to do with propaganda and disinformation in the 21st century, and I write the occasional book as well. We have a truly interdisciplinary panel, which makes it very exciting. Professor Benedetta Berti is the head of policy planning unit in the Office of the Secretary General of NATO. Qiang, did I say that right, Xiao? Is the founder of the China Digital Times and a professor at Berkeley. And Gerd Lenhardt is a futurist, a humanist, and the author of, most recently, Technology versus Humanity, which he will be signing copies of later. So I was very inspired by this session this morning, where there were these very deep and somehow melancholy reflections on 1989 and whether the values of 1989 are still pertinent. And in the small area that I look at, information, propaganda, media, I think we're seeing a real crisis in the principles of what we thought in 1989 made up a democratic information space. So those principles, they were axiomatic to us. I mean, freedom of expression, media pluralism, public service media values of information, accuracy, balance, objectivity, and of course the idea that information flowing across borders would lead to greater prosperity and peace. All those values were kind of wrapped up in the ideals of 1989, which is the victory of freedom of expression over censorship in many ways. And a few decades later, every one of those axioms and every one of those principles is really under question. The idea that pluralism would necessarily lead to better debate and better democracy has been brought into question by partisanship and polarization that is so extreme that debate can be undermined, or a constructive debate can be undermined. The idea of freedom of expression has been hacked by illiberal forces, by the far right, who claim that they can use freedom of expression to make racist claims, for example, but also in a much more subtle way by the nature of the new propaganda, where the more you express yourself online, the more your data is given to political spin doctors and advertisers who can then manipulate you in ever more targeted ways. For the first time, we see a connection where the more you express yourself, the less power you may have, which is a very new situation. Meanwhile, the ideals of public service broadcasting, of accuracy and fairness and balance, are being questioned by a sort of a casual relativism that you see emanating from the Kremlin, but also in the States, that says objectivity is impossible, and even facts are merely interpretations. And finally, the idea of information flowing across borders as leading to greater peace and prosperity has been brought into question by new breeds of subversion and information subversion happening across borders. So during this panel, I want to sort of get into more deeply and from the different perspectives of our panelists, what is the nature of this crisis? But then I want to do something positive. I really want to think about, okay, what do we do about it in the terms of regulation, in terms of new media practices? And how can the values of 1989 in the information space get a new lease of life in an era of completely new technology? So, Benedetta, maybe you'll start from your perspective. What are the changes that you find most alarming and the most puzzling, almost from from almost like a philosophical point of view? What do we do about them?
Right. Well, thank you for your question and for the introduction. It's truly great to be here, and I'm a little bit in awe of our platform and of this beautiful hall. So I hope I don't get too distracted by looking at the ceiling. Okay, let me start with one point. Not from a philosophical perspective, but from a doctrinal perspective, in the sense that what's changed and how has the information and manipulation of the information space become a greater security threat than in the past. I think this is one of the central questions many security analysts have been struggling with over the past decade or so. And there's sort of two schools of thought. Some people are saying, well, if you actually look at this, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was very effective in its propaganda activities, was very active, and we were active with countermeasures. So in other words, this is just more of the same. The idea that our potential competitors are going to use our democracy, use our free societies and manipulate us, and where we're most vulnerable, it's nothing new. I tend to disagree, because I think that it's not just about the tactic, but it's about the role of technology and how it makes the effect of this very old tactic much more effective, much more immediate, and much more diffuse, dispersed, and therefore much harder to counter. It's also about the fact that because of technology, the threshold has lowered, and therefore the number of players that can step in and try to manipulate our information space has increased. It's not just pure competitor governments, but it's also non-state armed groups. So to me, the question of the information space is really the broader question of how are emerging technologies and technology in general becoming a necessary factor to take into consideration when we look at the evolution of strategy. And I know I'll get to democracy in a second, but I just wanted to make this point because I think it's really in the background of this discussion. When we look at the future and we think of technologies like AI and its military applications, we think about technologies that allow for better facial recognition, for example, we see technologies that have potential to revolutionize society and warfare, which means that in the future, whoever has or whoever will have access to this technology, and so whoever has information or technological dominance will have battlefield superiority, which means it's a game changer. It means that for us, for example, as an alliance, as NATO, the question of how do you maintain a technological edge goes from one of the important questions to probably one of the most fundamental ones in determining the future of warfare. So this is more than just the battles, the battle space, the information space is really much broader in terms of the impact of emerging technologies. But now if I go back to your point, which is more what has changed in terms of how this affects our societies and the relationship to democracy and freedom, I think what is really interesting to me is the geopolitical lens through which we could look at these trends. And what you see here is the emergence of an alternative model, I would say, a techno-authoritarian model that tells us through the use of emerging technologies, we can create a stable authoritarian system that can be exported, that can promise prosperity, that can promise stability, but without freedom. And that's very appealing to many countries around the world. And I think we should keep our eye on that prize and think about how do we create and sustain a competitive alternative model, because this techno-authoritarian models is telling us, yes, one, you can use technology to control the information space and to shape the narrative. Two, you can use technology to make sure that only the voices that confirm your narrative are heard, and that those that may present an opposition are crushed. So the technology for surveillance, for repression is really becoming much more sophisticated in a way we would have never predicted even a decade ago. And it's being exported to a number of countries, and the number is growing. And then this model, this techno-authoritarian model says, we shape the narrative, we control the information space, we police the voices on this information space, and then we do something that will basically seal the deal, and that's we control the internet infrastructure, which is really what we should be paying attention to. And we will shape the international norms of this internet infrastructure so that it advances a vision of cyber sovereignty, for example, where the governments own the data, the governments own the internet infrastructure, and ultimately, I think through this combination of technology and regulation, you have what is a pretty strong, and I dare say difficult to counter once it's established architecture. So I think that's the eye on the prize. That's what we need to make sure that does not come into being. And I know we'll talk about what to do about it later, so I'll stop here. Oh, thank you.
I was in China recently researching my new book, and I was talking to some friends who are correspondents there, and they've been there, I think, 10 years. And I'm like, how do you talk to Chinese dissidents? I mean, what's the mode of communication? And they were like, well, the guy told me an anecdote, how he got in contact with a well-known Chinese human rights activist, and the guy was like, no, we can't talk over the phone's bugged. It's like, well, how should we talk then? It's like, oh, no, let's talk across WeChat or whatever the Chinese system is. And my friend, the correspondent, said, but hold on, that's completely monitored. And the guy said, I know, but it's so convenient. And I had the sense in China that actually their social media systems, their algorithms, were much more efficient than ours. And isn't that something that's changed quite a lot? Because back in the Cold War, the Soviet information space was poor and boring, especially towards the end, compared to the much more fun and lively one of the West. Has China worked that out as well? Not only is it a much better instrument of control, but they're also making it fun and convenient and kind of comfortable to use as well.
Yes. Yeah, in honor of the theme of the entire conference, let's start from 1989. At the time when the Tiananmen demonstration and protests, some Western media was a little bit exaggerating, not a little bit, quite exaggerating, reporting the technology of facts played a bigger role, which actually not. It is. There are some people using facts, the facts information out, and facts information in. But that's really not the main thing. People organized by students and inspired citizens and normal daily life communications at the 1989. But there are two things important in 89 in the information space. One is the Chinese official media. At a time when students' demonstration and then the Chinese high politics starting to split, it sort of sent a misleading message to the party system and down. There is a possibility that reformers will be winning. So for the 3 days, the official media turned to report and publicize the student demonstration nationwide. That 3 days lost control of official media of the Chinese Communist Party became the important lesson the Chinese Communist Party learned afterwards. They never want to do that again. Another thing that information space 1989 demonstration in China was actually technology did play a big role. TV, CNN, 24 hours footages in every living rooms around the globe make it as a globally impact event. So fast forward, after the demonstration and hope for democracy being crushed, there is a new hope revived in China, which is internet. Since the middle of the 90s, internet arrived in China. The government see is first of all, a technology must in order to boost the economy and make it possible, competitive for the foreign investment and all of that. But from many, many people, including many, many internet entrepreneurs and startup companies, they also see that's a hope for a freedom of information and a more open and a liberal China. And we all remember the digital promises that this type of internet empower everybody. They'll give everybody a voice, and then giving people capacity to organize, to communicate, to self-generate their agenda, and et cetera, et cetera. And then dictatorship, authoritarian regime will fail in such in front of such technology. To a certain degree, internet is, and social media in China did rise and did disrupt it. The official propaganda, official information control, official media control, to the point we see the second episode, which is the empire strikes back. Ever since Xi Jinping stepped in power, the level of control and the level of crackdown on the information space is unprecedented. But we also just noticed another story of this, which is the Chinese social media and Chinese internet in general and the technology sector actually growed economically, socially, and culturally. Chinese social media companies as competitive and innovative and profitable as any other major Silicon Valley companies. And technology also take a turn. It's not only just give everybody voice, empower individuals, it's actually empowering state and the big corporations, big data, artificial intelligence. These are the tools for people small group of people to gain the knowledge and information against the population. They can surveil, they can control, they can manipulate, they can micro-targeting a large population in scale and with ease. This is the situation we're facing now. I'll stop here.
Very quickly, when I was in China, I asked about micro-targeting. So for those who aren't tech-savvy, it's like micro-targeting is the idea that you can, fragment and define small audiences online and target them with tiny messages. And I asked a few people who know the Chinese internet to what extent that was happening in China, and they were like, you don't understand, the country's so big, there's only two audiences, the countryside and the cities, and we don't get any more precise than that. Is that true, or is there much, much more targeted messaging happening? There is a question of too much data sometimes. You don't know what to do with it.
It is true. China is a diverse place. Internet is also a diverse place. And social media has many little groups and chat rooms. And you do kind of find every kind of possible information there. But on the technological level, the controllers, meaning the Tencent company, the Baidu search engine, the state security and the public security, they have the back end to surveil everything. They have the information control tools that not individual has. You have a WeChat, you can say anything you want, but state know every single thing you have. And more than that, it's not even in the scale by algorithm, by the data they have, and by the computing capacity they have. Now they can control information space, not even mentioning the misinformation part and disinformation part, propaganda. All of this are becoming a powerful tool for the authoritarian regime. So now we're even talking about China is on the road to a digital totalitarianism, or we'll say the line between an authoritarian state and a totalitarian state starting to collapse under such technology. You can name it a postmodern authoritarianism, whatever you want to name it. But the level of micro-control and compatible state is greatly increased.
So this, disturbing reality where the algorithms know so much about us, clearly within the political context of China, that comes together with repressions and the lack of political freedoms. But as a kind of relationship of the human and the technology, that's exactly the same thing that we have as well. And your work is about this tension, isn't it, between the technology and the human. Tell us, is this actually embedded within the technology?
Yes, complicated question. I think, let me start with this one realization is that, we're living at the pivot point of exponential change. 10 years ago, we were still at the place where we didn't have voice translation really working well, or today we're at the point where we're going not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but 4, 8, 16, Moore's law, Metcalfe's law. We're at the point where science fiction is becoming science fact. And, we can talk to machines, we can get answers from a machine, we can drive in a driverless car, we can fly in a flying car even in Dubai. We're going to see things in the next 10 years that are truly straight out of science fiction. And if you're looking at computing power, we're going to go a place 1,000,000 times the computing power of what we have today in 10 years. quantum computing, polymorphic computing, the story goes on, right? So as the song goes, I used to be a musician, right? We ain't seen nothing yet. Right? We're at the on the scale of 1 to 100, we're at 2 or 3. So, however, having said that, I think the future is better than we think. Right? The future is better than we think because technology will give us a key to solve so many problems that can be solved by technology. Energy. Right? Shift to renewable energy, the end of oil, it's coming. Food, vertical farming, all of those things. Genetics, preventing cancer. The story goes on, it's all very good. The drawback is that technology is becoming so powerful that we forget who we are. Right? I always say the biggest problem is not that technology will take over or kill us. The biggest problem is that we become too much like technology. So we get lazy, we use assistants for everything, we stop having real relationships, we talk to our screen more than we talk to people. And again, this is just the beginning. Right? So what we need to do today is to say, let's harvest the good things from technology and restrain the negative things, the externalities. Right? And this is like climate change. The good things of oil is that we can drive our car, right? And we can be mobile. And I sometimes call that heaven, heaven and hell. So the heaven part is we can drive. The hell part is what we have now. Right? And technology is the same thing. We have the heavenly part, which is free content, free communications, global e-commerce, many good things. And then the hell part is complete surveillance, loss of privacy, cyber warfare. How do you solve the problem? We don't have a choice to go back and say, let's not use technology, right? That's not going to happen. Right? Our only choice is forward and using a precautionary approach by saying, we should do this because it's good for us, and we should not do this because it's not good for us, like autonomous weapons. Right? And so that, in my book, I talk about digital ethics. Right? Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, put it much better 6 months ago when he said, technology can do great things, but it does not want to do great things. It doesn't want anything. If we want good things with technology, we're going to have to make that work because technology does not solve social, cultural, political problems. That's our job. Right? Having said that, the good news is technology can solve so many good things. What we need is governance, agreement, discussion. That's what we're doing here, right? Awareness, and of course the will, ultimately the political will to use it in good ways. I think William Gibson, science fiction author, once said, technology is morally neutral until we use it.
So let's take this relationship of the human to the algorithm. So we've had this sort of nightmare version from China where you can chat almost as much as you like. Obviously some things are censored now, but still a lot more than in the Soviet Union. But the trick is that the more you talk to one another, actually the more you're surveyed, and the more the government can target you or oppress you or whatever, take various actions. We have a similar-ish sort of sense through what Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, the idea the more you communicate online, the more you can be targeted, definitely by commercial companies, but also by political forces who can buy the same data. What would be a new kind of relationship? Is there a new social contract that we can have? Because at the same time, as you say, there are so many positives of being surveyed. Google managed to anticipate a flu epidemic breaking out because it could tell that people were talking about certain medical systems or searching for medical systems and managed to stop a flu epidemic from breaking out. So how do we keep the positive while giving a person rights around their commercial issues and certainly political issues?
Well, I think this is a question clearly of balance, not of black or white. Like I use the mobile phone, but I don't use it 24 hours a day.
I do.
Yeah, well, in a way everybody does, right? But it's kind of like any drug, Like we allow alcohol in this country, and there are some rules about alcohol, but if you're 14, you can probably get a beer. It's not illegal, but we have rules, right? It's bad for you, but we have rules, right? So technology is kind of the same way. It's like we have to have rules that cover the extreme part, right? And have extreme rules for the extreme things, like artificial general intelligence, right? or autonomous weapons, or genetic engineering of humans, and so on. And the rest will be up for our discussion about what we find beneficial and what serves the human purpose, right? I mean, I think this is the difficult part, is that we need to get on the same page what we want, not what is possible. I mean, today we're sitting here and saying, okay, when I talk to my computer, it does not really understand me very well. In 10 years, I'm going to talk to a machine as if it was my girlfriend. Right? That's already possible, but yeah, it will be perfect then. Right? So basically, we have to ask the question, what do we actually want from technology? Do we want to be superhuman? Do we want to become a machine, like Singularity is suggesting? And these are very deep questions that go towards democracy as well, because many people are suggesting that an algorithmic governance would be cleaner. It's a crazy idea, but not unheard of.
Yes, I mean, I hear that from some great luminaries in Silicon Valley, and I suppose the Chinese approach is a little bit like that as well. They're kind of saying, is that their argument they're making to the population partly, this is also going to be more efficient, will be a more efficient state. I mean, you'll be surveyed, but you know, this is actually going to be, we'll have better hospitals and better roads because of this. Or is that part of the offer that's being given?
Sure, that's... people doesn't really have a choice. It doesn't really have a public debate about it.
Yeah.
Right? But in the mind of a state and on the media they control, certainly that's the narrative, right? China want to modernize, China want to develop, and this is good for stability, this is good for efficiency, this is for the economy, for convenience, and for China becoming a superpower, etc. But here's a couple of things we want to say. We always use the word technology, but let's be accurate a little bit more. The part you mentioned about information space, the social media, whether better for the democracy and how we make rules, it's only one part of the issue now. We are facing bigger technological space, as you mentioned. For example, we are facing companies, not only Google, not only Facebook, but in the era of Internet of Things, it could be car company, it could be your speaker, it could be your refrigerator, are all collecting data from you and from the individual. Our daily behavioral data will become something that those algorithms the companies use as a knowledge collectively or individually about us, but for the purpose of making profit or advance political advertisement or things like that. And in the authoritarian state, that can be also using that to politically suppress you, right? So the ability to predict the human behavior and to nudge the human behavior individually and collectively, those technology empowered that. So to whom? Who owns that power? How do you control that power? What you are discussing and raise the question, raise the direction, is of course we regulate it. Right? Make our democracy work. And for those who undermine humanity, undermine quality of our liberty, and we should regulate them, or threatening the life in general. But we also facing some other question. You want to regulate Google because Google is getting too big? Maybe. Break them out. Facebook too. But at the same time, China doesn't do it. Baidu and Tencent getting bigger, Alibaba getting bigger and bigger. In the time of big data empowered artificial intelligence, data is one of the key factors that you can advance your technological level. There's an algorithm, there's a talent, but you have to have very large amount of data. That's what China has. If you regulate the companies outside of China, and the matter of Japan or Europe, or particularly the United States, you leave the Chinese companies even advance more. Like right now, Chinese companies are on the leading edge of facial recognition, voice recognition. Why? Because of data.
Bernadette, what I so much liked about your introductory remarks was this image that you conjured up at the end of really an alternative authoritarian model for the information space and for the internet and technology. What would be the foundations of a democratic counterweight to that? I mean, a couple of things come to mind straight away. For example, and I think we're going to get this in some of the regulation that's coming through, oversight of algorithms, some sort of public oversight of algorithms, and a radical transparency, so that when we see things online, we understand, is it a real person or a Russian bot? So that already would make it very different to the Chinese internet, where it's quite the opposite. They want closed algorithms, and they want to keep Chinese troll farms going. But what are the other ones? What are the sort of the foundational principles of a democratic information space of the future?
So I think that is the question, but it's even broader. It's what are the foundations of a transparent, democratic, and open digital architecture, and where we live more and more of our lives in, right? So the information space is one piece of a broader puzzle, and I think the question, I will not have an answer, but I will have another question, which is, this is what we should be debating exactly right now. The question is, what do our rights and freedoms so hard won in our democracy, what do they look like online? What is the freedom of expression online? How do we ensure that the freedoms that we have won in the physical world are reflected in our online presence, which is pretty much an extension of our persona these days. Think of the freedom to protest. What does that look like online? What is legitimate? What it isn't legitimate? How do we guarantee legitimate rights, freedom of expression, and freedom of protest? To me, that's not to say that what you said is really important to ensure transparency, to ensure verification, that we have a clear way to understand where information comes from, if it's been manipulated, where it originates. But it should be discussed, in my opinion, as part of a broader conversation about what do we want the future of our democracy be like, because there is no future of our democracy without understanding what they look like in the digital space. So I think that's what we should be doing as democracies. We shouldn't be doing this alone, and we shouldn't think about it as a Western effort. I don't think it's helpful. I think we should work with our like-minded democratic partners globally. You can engage Korea, you can engage India, you can engage South Africa, many countries in Latin America. This should be our common interest to make sure that we do two things. On the international level, we promote a standard-setting mechanism so that we have common norms and common principles on these issues, but also on emerging technologies. What is ethical AI? What is ethical quantum computing? We should have this discussion in the international forum. And then as democracies, we should also have this discussion in our own societies. And the security bit I will add, and I'll stop here, is we shouldn't forget our infrastructure. In all this puzzle, we need to also make sure that we protect our critical infrastructure, that we protect our telecommunication infrastructure, and that we have a resilience and a resilience internet infrastructure and telecommunication infrastructure that allows us to then promote our values. So in other words, it's also what we buy, what we use, which technologies we employ. So if we have this conversation in the security and political realm at the same time, I think we're in a good place, which is not a solution, I know, but it's a start.
Yeah, you had a two-finger there. You want to jump in?
I'd like to comment on Xiao's China argument. I don't know enough about China. Having said that, I hear this all the time, that people are saying, well, if we don't do this, China is unlimited in their potential. They can use whatever data they want.
Well, actually, Google and Facebook like to say that whenever there's any chance of them being regulated, they're like, oh, well, we'll fall behind China.
And this is the argument, basically. China does evil things, parenthesis, so we can also do evil things, right? I call this the Oppenheimer argument. Yeah? Oppenheimer, of course, built a nuclear bomb. He built it primarily because he was worried about the Germans having the bomb, right? And in the end, it resulted in 2 bombs by the Americans. Right? So this is a kind of arms race argument. Right? I think if we look on the global level, artificial general intelligence, genetic engineering, and geoengineering are both potentially weapons. Right? What we're looking at on a global level is that these weapons will require moratoriums and regulation on a global level. Right? Yep. China already pulled back in the whole discussion about CRISPR-Cas9 after the doctor operated on the twins, was that 9 months ago, because China was worried about international blowback on this story of China experimenting with humans. Right? I don't believe that we can make an argument saying that China is going to build an artificial generally intelligent machine, and therefore we have to rush to build it before them. It sounds logical, right? Yes, but I think it's the wrong approach. I think we need to get on the same page for the extreme incidences of these kind of things, right? Because we have survived 2 nuclear weapons. We may not survive artificial general intelligence. Because, as was said earlier, it's a lot easier to build that stuff than to build a bomb. Right? So, talking about a 30-year horizon here, right? This is why I'm an optimist. I think we have at least 30 years before we have a super intelligent machine with an IQ of 1 million that is like a human.
Hold on, you're a futurist who thinks things are going to get better for a bit and then much worse, or what sort of futurist are you? Or it's always going to get better?
I think the next years will probably get worse in many instances. But generally speaking, it's better than we think because we have the tools, we just have to have the will. It's not the tools that we're missing. It's a discussion about what the tools should do.
But coming back to the next 30 years, Bernadette, I mean, I completely agree with you. What we need now is almost a piece of regulatory storytelling about what is human rights online, and so on. How do we take the principles of '89 and move them into this space? I actually think that we live in a new form of censorship today, where we don't understand how the information environment around us has shaped. That's incredibly corrosive to democracy, not only because it allows for Russian troll farms to do their work, but when Donald Trump's White House says 2020 elections are rigged because Google pushes up liberal news and pushes down conservative news, he might be right. We don't know. Because the algorithm is closed, that place where we're meant to have an open, Havel-style debate has disappeared. And so that, that trust that's needed for democratic decision-making is being whittled away. So I can imagine how we create, I can just about imagine, we have online courts to guarantee human rights online. I've heard this proposal several times now, the idea that we literally have human rights online. And by the way, Facebook has even said that it wants to bring international human rights as the core of its regulatory terms of service. I can see all that. I can just about imagine enough democracies agreeing somehow about what this is. But it still leaves the question of, is this going to be pleasurable for people? I mean, what I find so interesting about this the China model and a little bit of the Russian model is that they're not just doing, we're going to crush you with our ideology. They're saying, we'll find out loads about you and we'll make your life fun. It's much more Brave New World than 1984. And I can imagine us having a human rights-based, ethical, transparent internet with oversight of algorithms and with clear rights of how your data is used. But their internet is going to be more fun and more exciting and more efficient. How do we, I mean, I think there is like, this sense we do get left behind.
Just quickly, before we go to those things, we have to think about how companies are incentivized today. How does the stock market work? Right? The stock market works based on shareholder value. Full stop. If you can sell out humanity, if you can put a machine in my head and it makes money, it's fine. Right? And this is what Elon Musk is suggesting. Right? So 4 weeks ago, you had all the CEOs of the US in this, what's called the shareholder board, or the CEO board, whatever it's called, business board, say that shareholder value cannot be the only thing that matters in the future because it will lead to an implosion. Right? So now, this is the key question. If we're going to have a stock market for, say, what has been called people, planet, purpose, prosperity, the triple bottom line, then we can say, well, this company is doing the right thing, but it's making less money, it's okay. Right? Facebook, great example, makes $156 million profit per day. It's the most successful digital stock in the history of all the US stocks. Right? And if this is going to change, then every time there's an issue with Facebook, 27 times last year, the stock goes up. Right? In other words, the stock market appreciates evil behavior. Right? That needs to change.
I think in the history of sort of information, media and communications, there's always been a tension between commercialization and the social good. I think in Europe we do have a philosophy of public service, and I think there's a lot of thinking now about what is a public service Facebook or what is public service media in the digital age. So I think in Europe we'll get there. In America I see a real problem where there isn't a tradition of this. And I mean, the behavior that Facebook incentivizes and that Twitter incentivizes is towards taking extreme, polarizing positions. That's how you get likes and shares. That's how the ad tech system generates more money. So the whole system is geared towards summoning up politicians like Trump or Salvini. It's almost like brought them into being. But I want to open things up to the floor because we have an incredibly sort of talented and well-informed audience here. We have a box that we throw at you and that you can catch and say things into. I'm especially interested, I think, to hear from people who can tell us even more about the Chinese internet and what are the desires there that aren't being sated. Because look at what's happening in Hong Kong. You know, in the West, everybody is bored of democracy in some ways. While in Hong Kong, we see people sacrificing themselves for it. So clearly the Chinese internet can't satisfy something very fundamental and something still deeply connected to 1989. But I wonder whether we have the right language to express it in. Gentleman in the blue jacket. Yeah, it's the Internet of Things. It's recording everything.
It's very modern.
Yeah, I think you need to bring it closer to your mouth.
So, Chris Walker at NED. It was interesting that the Uighur Autonomous Region wasn't raised during the discussion because, in a sense, the piloting of this brave new technological surveillance state is in full view there. And as Samantha Hoffman has written very precisely and eloquently about, it didn't start in Xinjiang or even in Tibet, but this is part of a much longer investment in a tech surveillance authoritarian model that China has developed. And I think the tension in this discussion is the Chinese authorities don't brook dissent. It's a control regime, so there's nothing to suggest that they will modify their behavior. In the meantime, we have these challenges coming from the major tech firms on the west coast of the US that have not themselves settled on democratic and human rights norms around the technology. I see nothing to suggest that in the AI sphere, apart from enormous military and security investment on the one hand and enormous commercial investment on the other, that there's a meaningful discussion about how human rights and democratic norms will wrap themselves around AI and machine learning. So I'm just wondering, I don't have the answer. I'm going to pose another question, which is the kind of trend today. Whether the panelists can give us a sense of where the traction will come for the sort of norms we need around these new and emerging technologies, which are coming very quickly, irrespective of whether it's in the next year or two or the next 5 years, it's already upon us. And yet I don't really see the structure or the mechanisms to have meaningful democratic and human rights norms around these new technologies.
That's because you live in America. No, in Europe there is a huge regulatory push. In Britain we have a new the white paper on online harms, which is all about this. It's a mess. But no, I think there's a very vigorous regulatory movement in Europe. What my American friends then tell me is that the Europeans want to regulate the internet because they're jealous of American success, which is maybe a little bit true, but I don't think it's the whole story. My worry is that Europe drifts away from America even further in trying to understand this space. I think it's so important for us to have at least the lowest common denominator of regulatory principles and an idea of the good between all the democracies across the world. No, I think Europe will move towards regulation. Britain is moving towards regulation. Even America, I hear it now mentioned, but it's usually about breaking the companies up and antitrust, which I don't think is much of a solution to actually a lot of the big problems. But what do you guys think?
Well, Chris, thank you for raising the issue of Xinjiang and the technologies. We're not just talking about in general terms or futurist terms, right? We're talking about fact, like millions and millions of people and billion in China under such technology. The actual online investigation have found, for example, one database, live database, right, over 64 million Uyghurs, individual online information, the digital information, including identity and geo information, real-time monitored by the Chinese system, targeting on that particular ethnic group. But it's not just the Xinjiang. Again, in China, my own research group have found, for example, another live database in some third-class city of China, meaning it's not Shanghai, not Beijing, it's some third-class city, which means that technology probably uses all over the places, which monitor the real cell phone identity that in this particular database, live information on all the important private entertaining clubs in that city, meaning the people who have money and the power, as long as they go in with their cell phone, that technology will real-time remembers who and when and how long and where. Who would do that? The only one party would do that, which is the Ministry of State Security and Ministry of Public Security. Why you do that? Because they're monitoring the Chinese elite, the people who have the power and the money, that they are under surveillance all the time as well. That's how they govern the country. That's why the people stay in power. What I'm saying is these kind of Chinese technology are in real use and also on its way exporting along the Belt and Road and everywhere else toward the world. Every authoritarian regime will welcome that. Finally, let's say this is the country like China, the authoritarian regime has a competitive edge to develop, to deploy, and to export such technology. So that's the challenge we're really facing at the time of big data and machine learning and artificial intelligence. Now, yes, give all my respect to Europeans' effort to keeping the standard high and regulate. But on the technology development level, the top companies, if you count the top 20, they only in China and California, nowhere else. If you want to be able to catch up that space and development, make the regulation really have impact, that's where we have to go. Well, that's where the real challenge is. The more regulation in Europe, I'm afraid if you make European technology companies less and less relevant in this space, that's not good news for us, for all of us.
Can I just wanted to add a couple of very quick points. One on the reason why I'm not mentioning is I think we are using a specific country as an example, but of course we need to also look at this as a broader trend. This is not about just one element. And I think to go back to your point about the advantages of authoritarian governance plus surveillance technology, this is going to really help governments portray themselves as open enough by, for example, monitoring what are pet causes that we're interested in that don't interfere with the political elite's control. So, for example, I don't know, local playgrounds or some small increasing in the quality of air pollution, which is all great things to do. But if you cater towards that, you're able to sideline the bigger questions of human rights and governance and create an authoritarian model which I think is going to be very resilient and in some cases also popular. And I think that's something we need to figure out how to deal with. And again, I think this is a broader trend more than one specific country. On the AI, I agree that this is a central question. I'm a little bit more optimistic because I think as many of our countries are really developing their AI strategies in these years, they're coming together with a common set of concerns, and I think there is a slowly building up momentum that will foster that conversation. These are at least the signs that I see by reading tea leaves. The problem is, of course, by the time we've figured it out, the technology might have moved forward to such an extent that the policy responses we come up with don't fully account for everything. And that's the bigger problem we have when we're trying to regulate or to set up frameworks for emerging technologies. But the conversation is happening.
I'm going to take questions, but Gerd, can you while we take the question, speak while the thing gets thrown.
I really think it's quite obvious, going back to the question, we need sort of a humanist renaissance in the digital age. Mm-hmm. The first renaissance was about us saying that, it's not about God, it's about us. Mm-hmm. And now technology came, and technology is the religion now, right? I mean, that's a fact, right? So now we have to say it's not about technology, it's about us. And the key is on this is not going to happen in America, because that's where all the money is made with technology. It's not going to happen in China. It has to happen here. If there's going to be a renaissance of being human in digital age, it has to come from here.
And we're going to come back to that, because I've been thinking about that a lot as we've been talking, and it's obviously thinking about Havel a lot, because Havel's whole thing was how do you find the human in 20th century authoritarianism. But I'll come back to that. I want to take a couple of questions, and I don't want to hegemonize the conversation.
Yes. Yeah. Andrea Gombe from Congo-Brazzaville. We have also poor censorship in Africa for internet. It's just shutting down the internet and because they don't have a technology. My question is more for the NATO misuse is what we can do when all of the African cell phones are Chinese-based cell phones. And even the World Bank fund some backbone of internet backbone, and the country have the procurement to Huawei or to Tencent. So they are already building an internet, an alternative internet in Africa, while nobody's care about it.
Yes.
And Africa is the next big place for internet. So what is the solution and what do you think about it?
Let's take a few questions and then we'll see if we can take them together. I think that's a very, very important point. Let's take a few and then we'll try to combine them.
My name is Jonathan Taplin. I'm a professor at USC, and I wrote the first book to take on Facebook and Google called Move Fast and Break Things, How Facebook, Google, and Amazon Cornered Culture and Undermined Democracy. My worry is that I have not heard a single word about potential ways you might regulate these companies, and Gerd mentioned that Facebook is the largest market cap, quick growth company in the world. And the reason that is it had a unique government advantage in that it has a safe harbor. No one can sue Facebook for anything that's ever put on Facebook. No other company in the world other than Google has that protection. So Facebook can publish the live videos of someone invading and killing 56 Muslims in New Zealand and bear no liability whatsoever. It seems to me unless we're willing to take that on, nothing is going to change because these companies are not going to regulate themselves.
Okay, so intermediary liability, China in Africa, and there are all these people here as well. Make some noise, I didn't know you were there.
This is dangerous. Hi, my name is Arzu. I'm from Azerbaijan. My question would be on the extent of this authoritarian technology when it comes to censorship. For instance, a gentleman mentioned that they just shut down internet in your country, whereas in our country you buy the surveillance technology that allows you to create internet blackouts, but in addition to that also organize attacks against certain websites like DDoS attacks, or send phishing emails to civil society activists in order to retract information. And all of this in our context has a huge impact on the work that is being carried out by journalists or civil society activists because they rely on these online platforms to carry out their work, right? So, how do we also tackle this problem of, not only authoritarian countries buying authoritarian technology, but also how they're using it further to increase censorship in the country? And, as a representative of civil society, it's also really hard for us to catch up with countermeasures. And how do you, continue the battle, basically?
Okay. Oh, wow. I didn't really... Why don't we start doing these, and then we'll take the last one last round of questions afterwards. They're kind of linked, the intermediate liability question and the question of online cyber militias and mobs. My sense is, again, in Europe and Britain, we are seeing a shift around liability. The British regulation is proposing what they call a duty of care. So not to make companies, not to make them responsible for each bit of content, but do they have safety systems in place to protect government critics who are suffering attacks from government or are facing genocide via Facebook in Burma and Sri Lanka? So they would have a duty of care, and if they're not doing enough, then they would be in trouble, and the British are proposing very strong fines and imprisonment. So very serious stuff. I have to say the human rights lawyers are all taking the position of the companies, because they're like, this is too vague. You know, we can't have this, this is way too vague. You're threatening to put Mark Zuckerberg in prison without specifying what it is he needs to do. So, but that conversation has definitely started in Britain. I think in Europe they'll probably go even further. And I think they're going to undo some of the regulation in the EU around liability. America, again, for me, is a crazy place going into a crazy direction. But do you want to jump in on that as well?
30 seconds. I will not jump into this particular because there are other two questions that I want to very quickly try to address. One is the point. One is, of course, the point about the increased exports of surveillance technology and how to support civil society and activists who are really on the losing side of this battle when it comes to the balance of power. And I think that's why we need to have a global conversation with like-minded democratic countries and also civil society. Because, for example, in Europe we talk a lot about the principle of transparency, which is great, to make sure that we know you are who you say you are when you're active on the internet, so you can be accountable for your abusive behavior, which we say perfect, but in a context of freedom of expression, this is fantastic. But if we push that standard, what will that do to our civil society friends that are working in authoritarian societies and that need anonymity to survive? So that's why this is, I don't have the perfect answer, but I know that if we only do it in our closed room in Brussels, we won't get it right. So we really need to find a balance and to support our civil society in authoritarian countries, because they cannot, they need some of the anonymity that for us is a problem. And that's just one example. There's many others. On the point raised on Africa, this I think is fundamental, and the question we should be asking ourselves is what can we do to support democratic countries that want to remain democratic in terms of pushing for international transparency, accountability, providing support, while recognizing that we have a problem. And I think I'll stop here, but before I stop, maybe now it's a good time to stress that all these remarks are in a personal capacity. I forgot to say it, but you know, this, given where this is going, this is just, you know, my 2 cents.
Maybe 2 points on the...
Very
quick.
Very
First, on the issue of regulation, I think we need to think of the idea of a license to operate. Right? A company needs a license to operate. And the oil guys had that, allegedly, and telecoms have that, other companies have that. What about these guys, Facebook, Google, Amazon? Do they need a license to operate? They do, and we have to make one. Right? That's not going to happen in America because, you know, yeah, unlikely. It has to happen here. And this is our chance in Europe to come together as the United States of Europe eventually to create these kind of licenses. Right? I know it sounds like a crazy concept. Yeah. Second, on Africa, the answer is clear. This is a financial issue, right? We need to have a public license for technology to give to Africa so that we can afford Africa to have smart cities and telecoms and not just go for the cheapest possible deal, which is, you know, whatever Chinese company will fund it, right? So, and that of course clearly is mingling with the free market, which is, yeah, how we do that, I don't know.
Okay, so now I've got a challenge for the people asking questions. You have to do your question in 1 sentence, and it's a question, not like a lecture.
Do I have to throw it?
Imagine this is a tweet.
I have to make it angry then.
Yeah, I know. Cat's gif.
I just wanted to hear about your opinion on the other big trend in technology, which is crypto and blockchain, which is more of an optimistic or positive trend towards the democratization of data and decentralization and less surveillance.
Okay. And the other... Okay, you're going to have to be very quick because we'll just be cut off. They practice censorship here as well.
So I was actually thinking of sharing some experience, but I think there's no time, so I'll pass on that.
You can come and talk to us later. Good throw.
Good morning. Thank you very much for great thoughts. My brief question is your comment to the following statement. The generation of 1989 says that the most precious thing we had was we had experienced not to trust the media, that you cannot think that there is truth in the media. How crucial is this for 21st century? Thank you.
Another 2 hours.
Who wants to dive in? I know nothing about blockchain, so maybe somebody else can do the blockchain question.
I can talk about blockchain,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure we want to spend a lot of time. Yes, there's a very fundamental decentralization character of that technology. Actually, let me even go even more general. Yes, there are new innovations and new technological solutions, not only towards concentration of power and losing privacy, but from to solve to the other side, right? To protection, to protect our privacy, decentralize the power, etc. That should be encouraged. That kind of innovation, but it's not just naturally happen. Yeah. We haven't touched upon many other things such as genetic editing and all these other side of technological advancement. But what I want to say is, looking humanity even in a more deeper level, we cannot just fool ourselves to say freedom is the only thing human wants. Otherwise, there wouldn't be authoritarian regime. There wouldn't be the hierarchy. There wouldn't be the tribal. There wouldn't be the war. Humanity itself has this conflict nature of we have many, many characteristics that it's not the liberal democratic human rights principle simply can catch. But we are in this turn of history that what we established since Enlightenment, that see human is a autonomous, sort of agent, are facing a new wave of challenge in the new technical era. I see you are nodding, so I'll let you to take over.
So, I've been given, this is almost like something out of some sort of existential thing. Time is up, Peter, and a little smiley face going, I mean, this is how death comes for one. I'm going to have a last word, though, on that, because I think actually that's been the line in our discussion. What is the human? And does the new technology redefine the human? And does it make authoritarianism more appealing? And I'm going to end on a positive, which I think has got a Harvard-like sense to it. Because if so much of Harvard's work was about finding the human in a fake system. There's a very good new novel called Zed by an English novelist called Jonah Kavanagh, which is a comedy about a dystopian future where the algorithms control everything. Yeah? That all our behavior is predicted by algorithms. They find us our ideal jobs, our ideal wives, everything. But it doesn't work, because algorithms aren't the human. And I wonder if the new bit of where we find our reality will come in that when we realize what algorithms can't predict. So however good the Chinese system is at understanding its population, it still won't find everything. And it'll be in that space where we can find that idea of the human. That's it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.